The night had settled heavily over Babylon, its darkness pressing down like the weight of an unforgiving sky. The stars above, once symbols of hope and guidance, now seemed distant, cold, and indifferent to the suffering below. The fires from the battle had been extinguished, but their ghostly glow still lingered in the air, casting long shadows across the ruined city. Ira stood alone in the remnants of what had once been a bustling marketplace. The stalls that had once overflowed with the vibrant colors of spices, the rich scents of incense, and the lively banter of merchants were now reduced to splintered wood and ash. The streets, once filled with the voices of the city's people, were now eerily silent, save for the occasional whisper of the wind as it stirred the debris at his feet. His hand rested on the hilt of the Blazefrost celestial sword, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth of his skin. The sword, a weapon of incredible power, had been both his salvation and his curse. It had saved him and Babylon from certain destruction, yet it had also been the instrument through which he had wrought devastation upon the city he had sworn to protect. The thought weighed heavily on his mind, a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. He had pursued the Persian army, believing that he could stop them before they could inflict more harm on Babylon. He had left the city vulnerable, had taken the fight to the enemy instead of remaining to defend his people. And in doing so, he had allowed the monsters to breach the city's defenses, to bring destruction and death to the very heart of Babylon. Ira's breath came in slow, measured sighs as he gazed out over the ruins. The guilt gnawed at him, an insidious voice in the back of his mind that whispered of his failures, of the lives lost because of his decisions. He had been hailed as a hero, as the savior of Babylon, but what good was heroism when it came at such a terrible cost? His thoughts drifted back to the moment when he had ridden out of the city, his mind filled with the certainty of victory. He had been so sure of himself, so certain that he could turn the tide of battle with his strength, his sword, and his will. But he had been wrong. The Persian army had been a ruse, a decoy to draw him away from the city. And while he had fought bravely, it had been for naught. The true enemy had been waiting, lying in the shadows, ready to strike when he was most vulnerable. Now, as he stood amid the ruins of Babylon, he could not shake the feeling that he had failed his city, failed his king, failed the people who had looked to him for protection. The weight of that failure pressed down on him, crushing his spirit, leaving him hollow and numb. A reckoning with the king. As the night wore on, Ira knew what he had to do. The time had come to face the consequences of his actions, to confront the truth of his failures. He could not hide from it any longer, could not bury the guilt beneath layers of duty and resolve. He had to face the king, had to admit to his mistakes and accept whatever judgment would come. The journey to the palace was a somber one, the streets deserted, the silence of the night broken only by the occasional crackle of dying embers. The city, once vibrant and alive, now felt like a tomb, a place where the ghosts of the fallen lingered, their voices whispering through the ruins. The palace itself, though still standing, bore the scars of the battle. The great doors were splintered and charred, the walls marred by the marks of claw and fire. The once grand hallways, adorned with tapestries and treasures from across the empire, were now empty and cold, the echoes of footsteps the only sound in the vast emptiness. Ira made his way through the palace with a heavy heart, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The weight of the Blazefrost celestial sword at his side seemed to grow with each step, as if the sword itself was a reminder of the burden he carried. He reached the doors to the king's chambers and paused, taking a moment to gather his thoughts, to steel himself for the conversation that lay ahead. With a deep breath, he pushed the doors open and stepped inside. King Nabonidus stood at the far end of the chamber, gazing out of the window at the city below. The king's posture was weary, his shoulders slumped with the weight of the day's events. His robes, once rich and vibrant, were now tattered and stained with ash. Yet despite the toll the battle had taken on him, there was still a regal bearing to him, a strength that had not yet been extinguished. "Ira," Nabonidus said quietly, his voice carrying across the chamber without turning to face him. "I had a feeling you would come." Ira stepped forward, his head bowed in shame. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice thick with emotion. I have come to admit my failures. The destruction of Babylon, it is partly my fault. if I had not left the city, if I had not pursued the Persian army. Nabonidus turned to face Ira, his expression unreadable. The king's eyes, once sharp and clear, were now clouded with sorrow, but there was no anger in them, no condemnation. He looked at Ira not as a king looking upon a subject, but as a man seeing the burden that another bore. Ira, Nabonidus said softly, his tone gentle. You did what you thought was right. You fought for Babylon, for its people, for me. You have nothing to be ashamed of. But I left the city vulnerable, Ira insisted, his voice rising with the weight of his guilt. I should have stayed, should have defended the city. If I had been here. If you had been here, Nabonidus interrupted, you would have fought bravely, as you always do. But the outcome may not have been any different. The monsters, they were unlike any enemy we have faced before. They were relentless, merciless. Even if you had been here, Ira, the city would have suffered. Ira shook his head, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. I cannot accept that, Your Majesty. The people, they looked to me for protection, and I failed them. I cannot continue to serve you, not after this. Nabonidus's eyes softened, and he stepped closer to Ira, placing a hand on his shoulder. Ira, you are not to blame for what happened. This was a tragedy, yes, but it was not your doing. You fought with everything you had, and you saved countless lives. Without you, there would be no Babylon left to rebuild. I beg you, Your Majesty, Ira said, his voice breaking. Relieve me of my duties. I am not worthy to serve as your protector. For a moment, there was only silence between them, the air heavy with the weight of Ira's plea. Nabonidus studied him, his expression thoughtful, before he finally spoke. Banish you? Nabonidus said, his tone almost incredulous. Ira, Babylon cannot live without you for even a day. Enemies are everywhere. If we lose you, our people would live a life of slavery under the heel of the Persian Empire. Rebuilding Babylon might take time, but that is not as important as losing our sovereignty. Ira looked up at the king, his eyes searching Nabonidus's face for any sign of anger or disappointment. But all he saw was understanding, a deep empathy that only a ruler who had faced his own failures could possess. Babylon needs you, Ira, Nabonidus continued, his voice firm. Not just as a warrior, but as a symbol of hope. You have fought for this city, bled for it. And now, in its darkest hour, it needs you more than ever. You cannot walk away from that responsibility. But I failed. Ira began, but Nabonidus shook his head. You are human, Ira. You are not infallible. None of us are. But what matters is that you are here now, that you are willing to continue the fight. Babylon can be rebuilt, but it cannot survive without those who are willing to stand and defend it. You are one of those people, Ira. You always have been. The word struck a chord deep within Ira, resonating with a truth that he could not deny. He had made mistakes, yes, but he had also fought with every ounce of strength he had. He had not given up, had not turned his back on Babylon even in the face of overwhelming odds. And that, more than anything, was what mattered. Nabonidus's hand tightened on Ira's shoulder, a gesture of reassurance and solidarity. Do not punish yourself for what happened. Instead, use it to drive you forward. There is still work to be done, battles to be fought. And I cannot think of anyone I would rather have at my side than you. Ira felt the weight of his guilt begin to lift, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would not be easy, the task of rebuilding Babylon daunting in its enormity. But he would not face it alone. The people of Babylon, the king, and those who had survived the horrors of the battle, they would all stand together, united in their determination to see their city rise again. Thank you, Your Majesty, Ira said, his voice steadier now. I will not fail you again. Nabonidus smiled, a wearied but genuine expression. I know you won't, Ira. Together, we will rebuild this city. And we will show the world that Babylon is not so easily broken. The conqueror's despair. The vast halls of Persepolis, once filled with the sounds of triumph and celebration, were now eerily silent. The great palace, with its towering columns and opulent tapestries, felt more like a mausoleum than the seat of a mighty empire. The shadows that clung to the walls seemed to pulse with the weight of failure, as if they too had become infected by the despair that gnawed at the heart of Cyrus the Great. Cyrus stood alone in the grand hall, his broad shoulders slumped, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The firelight flickered across his stern features, casting deep shadows under his eyes, hollowing out his cheeks. He had not slept in days, not since the news of the fourth defeat against Babylon had reached his ears. His mind was a battlefield of its own, plagued by the memories of every failed campaign, every bitter defeat. He had thrown everything he had at Babylon, armies of thousands, towering giants, fire-breathing dragons, even the dark forces conjured by Nemesis. And yet, each time, he had been repelled, beaten back by the walls of that cursed city and the relentless force of its mysterious protector, Ira. The very thought of that name sent a spike of rage through Cyrus's heart, but it was quickly smothered by the heavy blanket of despair that had settled over him. In the flickering light of the torches, Cyrus could almost see the ghosts of his fallen soldiers, their eyes hollow, their faces twisted in pain. They haunted him, their silent accusations cutting deeper than any blade. He had led them to their deaths, had promised them glory and victory, only to deliver them into the jaws of defeat. The guilt gnawed at him, a persistent and unrelenting presence that would not let him rest. Cyrus the Great, King of Kings, ruler of the vast Persian Empire, had been brought low by a single city. Babylon, the jewel of the ancient world, had become his obsession, a prize he could not claim, a challenge he could not conquer. It had become a wound that refused to heal, festering in his soul, sapping his strength, turning his once unshakable confidence into doubt and despair. The darkness within. The throne room of Persepolis was a place of grandeur, its walls adorned with gold and precious stones, its ceiling high and vaulted, decorated with images of the gods and the great deeds of the Persian kings. But tonight, it felt cold and empty, its vastness only serving to magnify the loneliness that had taken hold of Cyrus's heart. He paced the length of the room, his footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Disappointment gnawed at every step, a relentless presence that clung to him like a shadow. He had always prided himself on his ability to conquer, to bend the world to his will. But Babylon had defied him, had stood against his might and emerged victorious time and time again. He could still see the fires burning in the distance, the plumes of smoke rising from the city's walls, the screams of his soldiers as they fell before the icy onslaught of Ira and his cursed sword. The image was seared into his mind, a constant reminder of his failure, a failure that had now become a part of him, entwined with his very being. Cyrus clenched his fists, his nails digging into the flesh of his palms. How had it come to this? How had he, the great conqueror, the man who had built an empire from nothing, been brought to his knees by a single city? The question echoed in his mind, tormenting him, driving him to the edge of madness. He had used every tool at his disposal, had summoned the mightiest armies, had called upon the most fearsome beasts, had even dabbled in the dark arts, all in the name of victory. But each time, he had been met with defeat, his forces crushed, his plans thwarted. And now, after 4 attempts, he was left with nothing but the bitter taste of failure. Could he swallow this defeat? The answer was clear, no. A conqueror like Cyrus the Great could not accept defeat, could not allow his legacy to be tarnished by the specter of failure. But what more could he do? He had exhausted every resource, had thrown everything he had at Babylon, and still, it stood defiant, a symbol of his impotence. The thought of Ira, the mysterious warrior who had become the bane of his existence, filled him with a cold, simmering rage. How could one man, one lone protector, stand against the might of the Persian Empire? It defied reason, defied everything Cyrus had ever believed in. Ira was no ordinary man, of that, Cyrus was certain. He was something more, something otherworldly, something that had been sent to thwart his ambitions at every turn. But what was he? And how could Cyrus defeat him? The shadow in the mirror. Cyrus moved to the mirror that hung on the wall, its surface polished to a flawless sheen. He stared at his reflection, his eyes drawn to the lines of worry etched into his face, the exhaustion that clung to his features like a shroud. The man who looked back at him seemed older, wearier than the great king who had once led armies across the known world, who had built an empire that spanned continents. "How far you have fallen," he muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper. But even as he spoke, a strange sensation crept over him, a prickling at the back of his neck, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. His reflection in the mirror wavered for a moment, the image blurring, as though the glass were rippling like water. Cyrus blinked, his breath catching in his throat. When his vision cleared, the reflection in the mirror had changed. It was still him, still Cyrus the Great, but there was something different, something unsettling about the figure that now stood before him. The reflection's eyes were darker, more intense, and the smile that curled its lips was one of cold amusement rather than the weariness that Cyrus felt. It was as though the mirror had captured a version of him that existed only in the darkest corners of his mind, a shadow self that had been waiting for this very moment to reveal itself. The reflection leaned closer to the glass, its eyes locking onto Cyrus's with an intensity that made his skin crawl. And then, in a voice that was both his own and not his own, it spoke. "You are a conqueror, Cyrus," the reflection said, its tone smooth and deep, resonating with a power that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. "A man born to rule, to bend the world to your will. And yet, here you stand, wallowing in defeat, questioning your own strength. How pathetic." Cyrus stiffened, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his sword, but the reflection only laughed, a low, mocking sound that sent a shiver down his spine. "Who are you?" Cyrus demanded, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of fear. The reflection's smile widened, and it reached out as though to touch the surface of the glass. "I am you, Cyrus. I am the part of you that you have tried to bury, the part that knows no fear, no hesitation. The part that is not bound by the petty concerns of morality or doubt. I am the darkness that you have always carried within you, the shadow that follows you wherever you go." Cyrus felt a chill run through him as he listened to the reflection's words. There was a truth in them, a dark truth that he had always known but had never wanted to confront. He had built his empire on blood and conquest, had taken what he wanted by force, had crushed those who stood in his way. And yet, he had always justified it, had always told himself that it was for the greater good, that his rule was a necessary one. But now, as he stared into the eyes of his reflection, he saw the lie for what it was. He was not a benevolent ruler, not a savior of his people. He was a conqueror, a man who took what he wanted, who cared little for the cost. "And what do you want from me?" Cyrus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The reflection's eyes gleamed with dark amusement. "I want you to remember who you are, Cyrus. I want you to cast aside these petty doubts and embrace your true nature. You are a conqueror, and conquerors do not allow defeat to weigh them down. They rise, they strike again, and they take what is rightfully theirs." Cyrus felt the darkness within him stir, responding to the reflection's words. It was a seductive voice, one that spoke to the deepest parts of his soul, the parts that craved power, that longed for victory at any cost. "But I have tried," Cyrus said, his voice trembling with a mixture of frustration and fear. "I have tried, and I have failed. Babylon stands against me, and Ira. Ira is too powerful." The reflection's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold determination. "Ira is a thorn in your side, yes. But he is not invincible. He is strong, but he is not a god. And he can be defeated." "How?" Cyrus demanded, his frustration boiling over. "How can I defeat him when everything I have tried has failed?" The reflection leaned closer, its eyes narrowing with a fierce intensity. "Bree," it whispered, the word dripping with dark promise. "Bree will destroy Ira. Bree will be the weapon that brings Babylon to its knees." Cyrus frowned, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the reflection's words. "Bree? What is Bree?" The reflection's smile returned, but it was colder now, more sinister. "Bree is power, Cyrus. Bree is the darkness given form, the weapon that will crush your enemies and ensure your victory. Bree is what you need to finally claim what is yours. And where do I find this Bree?" Cyrus asked, a mixture of curiosity and suspicion in his voice. The reflection's eyes gleamed with a strange, dark light. Bree will come to you when the time is right, when you are ready to embrace your destiny. But you must be patient, Cyrus. You must trust in the power you have unleashed, and when the time comes, Bree will be yours. Cyrus felt a strange sense of anticipation growing within him, a thrill of excitement at the prospect of finally achieving the victory that had eluded him for so long. But beneath that excitement was a nagging doubt, a sense of unease that he could not shake. And what is the cost? Cyrus asked, his voice low and cautious. What will it cost me to summon Bree? The reflection's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it, only cold calculation. Every victory comes with a price, Cyrus. But you have already paid it. You have already chosen your path, and there is no turning back. Embrace the darkness, embrace your destiny, and you will have the power you seek. Cyrus stared at his reflection, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The promise of power, of victory, was intoxicating, but the price. The price was something he could not fully grasp, something that lay just beyond his understanding. But he had come too far to turn back now. He had made his choice, had opened the box, had unleashed the darkness. And now, he had to see it through. I will do whatever it takes, Cyrus said, his voice filled with determination. I will not be defeated again. The reflection's eyes gleamed with approval, and it nodded slowly. Good. Remember, Cyrus, you are a conqueror. You are destined to rule, to bend the world to your will. Do not let anything stand in your way. Bree will come to you, and with it, you will crush your enemies and claim your victory. Cyrus felt a surge of confidence, a renewed sense of purpose. The doubts that had plagued him, the weariness that had weighed him down, seemed to melt away, replaced by a cold, ruthless determination. He was Cyrus the Great, and he would not be defeated. The reflection in the mirror watched him with a satisfied smile, its eyes filled with a dark, knowing light. Go now, Cyrus, it said softly, its voice a whisper that seemed to echo in the chamber. Prepare yourself for what is to come. The final battle is approaching, and you must be ready. When the time comes, Bree will be there, and you will have the power to destroy Ira and claim Babylon as your own. Cyrus nodded, his mind already turning to the preparations that needed to be made. He had been given a second chance, a final opportunity to achieve the victory that had eluded him for so long. And this time, he would not fail. As he turned away from the mirror, a sense of anticipation thrumming through him, the reflection watched him go, its smile fading into a look of cold calculation. The darkness that had been unleashed was now a part of him, a shadow that would follow him wherever he went, guiding him, pushing him toward his ultimate destiny. But even as Cyrus left the chamber, the reflection remained, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. It had told him what he wanted to hear, had given him the hope he needed to continue. But the truth, the full extent of the price he would pay, was something Cyrus would discover only when it was too late. For in the darkness that now coursed through his veins, and the power that he had unleashed, lay a force that would not be easily controlled. A force that would demand its due, that would take from Cyrus far more than he could ever have imagined. And as the reflection slowly faded from the mirror, its presence lingering like a shadow in the room, a cold, cruel voice whispered through the darkness. The conqueror's path is paved with blood and sacrifice, Cyrus. And you will pay the price, whether you realize it or not. But Cyrus, blinded by his desire for victory, did not hear the warning. He had made his choice, had embraced the darkness, and now, there was no turning back. The battle for Babylon was far from over, and the final confrontation would be one that would shake the very foundations of the world. But at what cost? That was a question that only time would answer. As the night deepened and the shadows grew longer, the mirror returned to its normal state, its surface once again reflecting nothing more than the room around it. But the presence that had been there, the darkness that had spoken to Cyrus, was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when it would finally claim what it was owed. And in the silence of the chamber, the echoes of that cold, cruel voice lingered, a reminder that every victory comes with a price, and that price was one that Cyrus the Great would soon discover.